The Soviet Union lasted for 70 years, and then it collapsed. East Germany fell. Cuba nearly went bankrupt. Even China, North Korea's closest ally, abandoned orthodox communism and opened its economy in the 1980s. Countries with larger armies, stronger economies, and bigger populations all changed. They all adapted to a new world. But North Korea didn't. It has continued under essentially the same system of government for decades, and no one seems to do anything to change that. So why is that? Why don't the United States or the countries of Europe try to intervene? In this video, we're going to answer that question. You'll find out why China, a country that's so different from North Korea, continues to support Pyongyang. Why the United States, despite intervening in so many other countries, has never invaded North Korea, and why North Korea, in a way, still needs to exist. And I'll show you that the answer is far more uncomfortable than you might expect. Before anything else, there's one fact that many people still don't know. The Korean War never actually ended, and that's not just a figure of speech. In 1953, the countries involved in the conflict signed an armistice, which is essentially a ceasefire, a mutual agreement to stop fighting, at least for the time being. But they never signed an actual peace treaty. That means that, from both a legal and military standpoint, North Korea and South Korea are still technically at war to this very day, even as you're watching this video. And understanding that is essential if you want to understand the mindset of the North Korean regime, because the narrative the government uses to justify its actions is built on that very idea. The North Korean government tells its people that they're surrounded by enemies, that South Korea is nothing more than an American puppet, and that an attack could come at any moment. And the reality is that, at least officially, that threat has never been formally removed. But how did these two countries, two nations that were once a single Korea, end up in this situation? To answer that, we need to go back to 1948. When World War II came to an end, the Korean peninsula had been under Japanese occupation for decades, but after Japan's defeat, the peninsula was divided into two separate spheres of influence. The North came under Soviet control, while the South fell under the influence of the United States. The plan was for the division to be temporary, a short-term arrangement while the future of a unified Korea was being decided. But then came the Cold War, and what was supposed to be a temporary arrangement became a permanent division. In 1948, two separate governments were officially established. In the South, the Republic of Korea. In the North, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which, despite its name, is neither truly democratic nor much of a republic. But that's the name the regime chose. Kim Il-sung, a former guerrilla fighter who reportedly fought against the Japanese and was later backed by the Soviet Union, became the leader of the North. 2 years later, in 1950, North Korea invaded the South in an attempt to reunify the peninsula by force. The United States intervened in support of the South. China entered the war on behalf of the North, and the conflict became one of the largest and deadliest wars of the second half of the 20th century. It was a complete catastrophe, and this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. During the 1970s, North Korea was actually more economically developed than South Korea. The country we now associate with blackouts, famine, and poverty was once the more prosperous half of the peninsula. It had inherited a strong industrial base from the Japanese occupation, possessed abundant mineral resources, and, perhaps most importantly, it knew exactly how to play the geopolitical game of the time. The Cold War created a unique opportunity for North Korea. On one side stood the Soviet Union, on the other was China. And during that period, the two communist powers were locked in an increasingly bitter dispute, known as the Sino-Soviet split. Officially, China and the Soviet Union were allies. In reality, their relationship had become deeply strained. Kim Il-sung realized he could take advantage of that rivalry. When North Korea needed oil, he'd turn to Moscow and suggest that China was becoming too demanding. When he needed technology or other forms of support, he'd do the opposite. By playing both sides against each other, he managed to keep both countries backing North Korea without ever becoming fully dependent on either one. But everything changed in the 1990s. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was an earthquake for North Korea. And that's not an exaggeration. Almost overnight, the country lost its largest supplier of heavily subsidized oil. It also lost its biggest source of leverage over China. From that point on, Beijing was in a much stronger position to dictate the terms of its support, and the result is essentially the relationship we see today. Between 1994 and 1998, North Korea went through a devastating famine that the regime officially referred to as the Arduous March. Millions of people endured extreme hardship. The country's centrally planned economy, which had relied heavily on subsidies from its allies, collapsed. To make matters worse, North Korea never truly opened itself to international humanitarian aid. It allowed some assistance into the country, but tightly controlled its distribution, consistently prioritizing the military and senior members of the ruling party, while many remote regions, and even areas considered less loyal to the regime, were left to suffer the worst of the famine. At that moment, almost everyone believed North Korea was on the verge of collapse, but they were wrong. Unfortunately, today's North Korea is built around a single idea: Juche. Juche is the official ideology of the North Korean state. It was developed by Kim Il-sung, and at its core, its message is remarkably simple. Rely only on yourself, complete self-reliance, and absolute independence from the outside world, which is ironic coming from North Korea. The regime built an entire national identity around the idea that depending on other countries is a sign of weakness and that accepting foreign aid is a humiliation. But that doesn't really make sense because North Korea has always depended on outside support. That's the biggest contradiction. And what makes Juche such an interesting ideology? It's essentially a tool of political control. It's a narrative of national identity, not something that's actually meant to be practiced literally. It allows the regime to tell its people, "We're isolated because we chose this path. We're strong enough not to need anyone else." It's a form of psychological conditioning, a remarkably effective reversal of reality. As a result, the country's isolation, having little or no access to the outside world, stops being seen as a weakness and instead becomes a source of national pride. And Juche serves another important purpose as well. It convinces people that any economic hardship the country experiences is the result of foreign hostility, outside sabotage, or pressure from the United States and South Korea. It's never presented as the consequence of the government's own failures. The blame always comes from outside. The government is always portrayed as the protector, never the one responsible. That also helps explain why the regime survived the devastating famine of the 1990s, largely intact. While people were struggling to survive, the government successfully framed the crisis as the result of foreign sabotage and external pressure, rather than the failure of its own policies. But it never managed to completely control how people thought. Human beings always find ways to adapt. A good example came during the Arduous March. As the state's economic system collapsed, people did what anyone would do when left with no other options. They found ways to survive. Informal markets began appearing all across the country. People sold whatever they had: clothes, tools, food they managed to grow on small plots of land, or simply traded goods directly with their neighbors. A whole network of unofficial local economies emerged from the ground up. And when the government saw this happening, it faced a very difficult decision. They allowed it to happen, but in a gradual and tightly controlled way. Over time, the government began regulating these markets and eventually found ways to profit from them as well. By the time Kim Jong-un took power in 2011, following the death of his father, Kim Jong-il, this process was already underway, even though the government officially denied it. Once Kim Jong-un took over, however, he accelerated and expanded the process in ways few people expected. He formally recognized many practices that had already emerged, acknowledged certain markets as legitimate parts of the economy, allowed state-owned enterprises to operate with more market-oriented principles, and gave managers greater autonomy to make decisions based on economic performance rather than simply following party directives. The result of these structural reforms is that today, roughly 70% of North Korea's economy involves some form of market activity, a kind of tightly controlled, state-supervised capitalism. All of this in a country that officially describes itself as socialist and self-reliant. It's contradiction after contradiction. The regime continues promoting the rhetoric of socialism and the ideology of Juche, while operating an economic system that would likely be considered unacceptable or even unrecognizable to the founders of the North Korean state. There's another factor that's kept the regime alive to this day, and it's every bit as important as the Soviet Union once was. That factor is, without question, China. In some years, China has accounted for more than 90% of North Korea's foreign trade. And the reason China continues supporting North Korea isn't as simple as many people think. It's not because they're communist friends. For China, North Korea is a strategic asset. It serves as a buffer state between China and South Korea, and, by extension, between China and the American military bases stationed across South Korean territory. Think about the geography for a moment. If North Korea were to collapse, and the entire Korean peninsula ended up aligned with the United States, China would suddenly share a border with a U.S. ally hosting American troops just a few hundred kilometers from Beijing and from some of China's most important industrial regions. From Beijing's perspective, that's simply unacceptable. No matter how frustrated Chinese leaders may become with North Korea, the instability it creates, or the diplomatic burden of defending the regime, the strategic calculation remains the same. Xi Jinping's government has every incentive to keep North Korea alive, because doing so serves China's own national security interests. That's why China continues supplying oil, remains North Korea's primary trading partner, helps soften, or sometimes block, harsher United Nations sanctions, and continues to be the country that places the greatest limits on international pressure against North Korea. And recently, another major player has entered the game. Since 2022, with the war in Ukraine, Putin's Russia and Kim Jong-un's North Korea have grown closer than at any point since the Cold War. North Korea has been supplying Russia with artillery shells and missiles for use in Ukraine, and in return, it has been receiving oil, food, and technology. Even some of the new apartment buildings and skyscrapers that have appeared in Pyongyang are believed to have been made possible, at least in part, by this renewed partnership. And there's one final reason why the North Korean regime has survived to this day. In 2006, North Korea detonated its first underground nuclear device. The world reacted with outrage. There were sanctions, speeches at the United Nations, and widespread international condemnation. North Korea simply ignored it all and continued developing its nuclear program. Kim understood what had happened to countries that backed down under international pressure. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, was invaded in 2003 based, among other claims, on allegations that it possessed chemical and biological weapons. Libya, under Muammar Gaddafi, gave up its nuclear program in 2003 as part of an agreement with the West. And in 2011, Gaddafi's government was overthrown with Western military support. Gaddafi was captured and later killed, and the North Korean regime watched all of this very carefully. The conclusion they reached was remarkably simple. Countries without nuclear weapons are vulnerable to foreign intervention. Countries with nuclear weapons are not invaded. And North Korea didn't stop at simply acquiring nuclear weapons. It developed intercontinental ballistic missiles with enough range to reach the United States. There's no guarantee they would work perfectly or successfully penetrate American missile defense systems, but the uncertainty alone is enough to make any military intervention far more dangerous. So when people ask why the United States, with the largest military budget in human history, doesn't simply solve the North Korea problem in a single day, the answer is much closer than they might think. The cost of making the wrong calculation is simply too high, not for North Korea, but for Seoul, a city of nearly 10 million people, located just 60 kilometers from the border. And for Tokyo, along with every American military base in the region, geography also plays a major role. North Korea is an extremely mountainous country, and its military infrastructure is built with that terrain in mind. Invading North Korea would be nothing like invading Iraq. It would be one of the most unpredictable and dangerous military operations imaginable. When you put all of these factors together, China's support, Russia's backing, and the mindset the regime has cultivated among its population, you begin to understand how North Korea has managed to survive for so long, and why the international community has largely chosen to preserve the status quo rather than attempt to overthrow the regime and liberate the population, and they're likely to remain that way for a long time to come. Let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. We're releasing new videos almost every day here on the channel, so be sure to check out the rest of the channel. And don't forget to take a look at the links in the description if you'd like to support my work. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.